Captain America Civil War has been my most anticipated movie of the year for quite a while. That's not to say that I didn't have reservations going in. I feel like a story such as Civil War, which is so big and involves so many different characters, doesn't necessarily lend itself to the medium of film, in as much as it's quite difficult to balance those characters, those story arcs and plot lines and threads, and do so in a satisfying way. But I must say that I left Civil War having absolutely loved the film and with a giant stupid grin across my face. It's directed once again by the Russo brothers, who directed the previous Captain America film, The Winter Soldier, which is arguably one of Marvel's best movies to date. And it's also written by, once again, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, who wrote the original Captain America, the first Avenger movie, and then Captain America The Winter Soldier. They're back for this one. This entire creative team, the writers and directors, will also be doing Avengers Infinity War Parts 1 and 2 in a couple of years' time. In terms of theme and tone, it's very much a direct sequel to The Winter Soldier, and picks up a lot of the plot strands and threads that were left dangling from that movie. So we once again have Captain America played by Chris Evans, played brilliantly by Chris Evans, I must say, who is leading his new team of Avengers that we saw at the end of Age of Ultron. So these include Black Widow, Scarlet Witch, The Vision, a new team of Avengers, and also Falcon and War Machine, on a mission to stop Crossbones, played by Frank Grillo, who survived the events of The Winter Soldier, from stealing a biological weapon. Needless to say, and I'm going to avoid spoilers as best I can, the mission goes awry, and we are then presented with what's called the Sokovia Accords, which are supported by Iron Man, Tony Stark, played once again brilliantly by Robert Downey Jr., and General Thunderbolt Ross, who is played by William Hurt, returning to the role for the first time since 2008's The Incredible Hulk. Now, these Sokovia Accords basically take into account all the Avengers' past transgressions, their world-saving antics which resulted in loss of life through collateral damage, up to and including this latest mission that kicks off the movie Captain America Civil War. Tony is all for signing this treaty, essentially, that gives the UN power over the Avengers, and has to basically, any Avengers activities must be approved by the UN, and they will tell the Avengers where to go and what to do. Tony's all for that, because he feels responsible for a lot of this collateral damage following the events of Age of Ultron. Of course, he created Ultron and kicked that film's plot into motion. Chris Evans' Captain America is very much against signing away the Avengers' independence, because he's seen what can happen when you work for some sort of organisation. As he puts it very eloquently in the film, you know, organisations have agendas, you know, they're made up of individuals who have political agendas who may not be all that they seem. Following the events of The Winter Soldier, you can't really blame him for thinking that. What I do think this film does really well is very accurately and very deeply presents both sides of the argument. I don't think that anybody will sit through this movie from beginning to end, or even leave the movie with a clear idea of which character they support, because each character is making a lot of good points. You know, those points are informed by their previous experience, which we've witnessed in the previous kind of 12 Marvel movies or whatever it is by now. But they are also frustratingly stubborn and refuse to look at each other's point of view. For that reason, you know, you'll find yourself over the course of the movie going, well, I do agree with Cap, and then something will happen. You go, actually, no, Tony's got the right idea. And you do have a certain character stuck in the middle who tends to flip-flop between the two, and you can completely understand why. I think the fact that they managed to so thoroughly explain each character's motivations in this movie is a testament to the screenwriters and the directors. Because at no point do you feel like any decisions they make for the convenience of the plot. They all feel organic and born from the characters and their experiences. So that was done really, really well. Another thing the film does really well is that it's no secret this film contains pretty much all the Avengers. The only ones missing are the Hulk and Thor, who are off doing their own thing in Thor Ragnarok, which is due, I believe, next autumn kind of time. So they're not in this, but other than them, everyone's here. You know, Vision, Scarlet Witch, I've already mentioned. What this film does really well is it balances these characters in such a way that each is given, despite very limited screen time, a well-rounded, satisfying emotional arc. You know, it may not be a very big arc, but they're each given an arc in some sense, and you feel like no character really gets short shrift in this movie. You know, from the Vision to Scarlet Witch to even Ant-Man, you know, who is just so pleased to be involved because he's a bit of a Captain America fanboy. You know, the characters that sort of really are nothing more than extended cameos feel like well-rounded characters with their own motivations, and it's so impressive that the screenwriters managed to do this, because when you have that many plates spinning, it's quite easy to drop one. But all that stuff was done really well. Now, we also need to talk about the introduction of two major new characters, the first being Black Panther. Now, Black Panther is the new hero who's introduced in the best way, I feel. Chadwick Boseman plays T'Challa, who is basically the prince and then subsequently king of the African nation Wakanda, which cropped up in Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, the reason that Black Panther's introduction works as well as it does is that he feels naturally born out of the plot of this movie. He feels integral to the plot. He feels like such an important part of the plot that if you didn't have the character of Black Panther in this movie, then the movie would fall apart. That, coupled with Boseman's performance, who brings a great regal strength but also vulnerability to the role, means that Black Panther is going to be a lot of people's favourite new character, and I for one cannot wait to see him in his solo movie, which is due to be directed by Ryan Coogler, who did Creed and the brilliant Fruitvale Station. Black Panther was great, the suit looked great, the action he's involved in is great, and the character, his arc, and he does have an arc, you know, given that he's newly introduced in this film and is very much a supporting character, he has a very satisfying arc, and one that really leads you to fall in love with the character to a certain extent, so he was great. The other character that's introduced in this is Spider-Man. Now, this incarnation of Spider-Man, I must say, is brilliant. You know, they've cast 19-year-old Tom Holland as Peter Parker. It's the first time that a teenager has played Peter Parker, and he really has that teenage, naive feel to the character, and that's something that we've not really seen in Spider-Man before. You know, he is the wisecracking webhead, frustratingly so. You know, in one of the big action scenes that he's involved in, he's told at one point, you know, is this your first fight? Because there's not usually this much talking. But unlike Andrew Garfield's interpretation of the character, it never comes off as annoying. It feels like Spider-Man, it feels like Peter Parker under that mask. You know, he is a naive teenager with a big gob when he puts his mask on, and I feel like they executed that really well. The suit looks great in motion. I must say it looks better in the finished film than it did in the trailer. The suit looks great, the action, the way they shoot Spider-Man is great. And, you know, I can't really fault the interpretation of the character. What I can fault, though, is how he's introduced in the movie. Because the movie is pretty much on rails. You know, in the same way The Winter Soldier was paced brilliantly, this film has a really fast pace. And then all of a sudden, there's a massive sharp left turn in the middle of the movie where we go to meet Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And it does feel like you could probably take Spider-Man out of the movie altogether and it'd make no difference to the film. You know, you could have had his introduction between Tony and Peter. That could have been a post-credit scene. You know, it doesn't feel integral to the plot in the way that Black Panther does. Now, like I said, I loved the interpretation of Spider-Man, but it did feel from a filmmaking standpoint like that is a little bit baggy and a little bit, not necessarily shoehorned in, but not as natural a progression of the story as the way they introduced Black Panther. So that's a minor criticism. Another minor criticism I have of the movie, because it's not flawless by any means, is some of the CGI is a bit wobbly. You know, there's a shot of an armoured car from above and then a couple of shots of characters running amongst traffic, which do look like pretty poor CGI, to the point where those shots actually took me out of the moment. You know, and that's really... It's a shame because a lot of the time you can forgive poor CGI because you're so invested in the moment and what's happening on screen. But I must say that the CGI sort of was so poor that it did pull me out of the film at a couple of points. But that's not to say that the effects overall are poor, because most of the CGI is seamless and a lot of the stunts are practical and in camera, which gives the film a real grit and a real weight to the action scenes that you wouldn't otherwise get. So it's a shame that some of the CGI is a bit wobbly, and I do get the impression it may be because they were rushed for time. I know that they were still finishing the airport fight scene, which is pretty much flawless, up until about 2 weeks before the film was due for release, so that could explain why some of the CGI shots look a bit unfinished. The airport scene, though, that I've just mentioned, which is what all people are mentioning in reviews, is fantastic. People have complained online that it contains too many quips, but ultimately the scene does what it needs to, in as much as it shows how these characters' powers work not only together but against each other. It shows how these characters relate to each other and really uses their already established dynamics to inform the fight scene. At no point are you lost in terms of who's fighting who and why and what each character wants. It's really a remarkable feat that they managed to pull it off. That airport fight scene is the standout. What I did think while I was watching the film is that airport fight scene sort of happens halfway through the movie, and I was worried at how they would top that in the third act, because we really didn't want another formulaic city levelling destruction third act. But we didn't get that. You know, the Russo brothers had the good sense to have the third act be a lot more confined and intimate and small scale, which it needed to be. And you also treated Robert Downey Jr.'s probably best performance as Tony Stark, as well as Chris Evans and Sebastian Stan as Captain America and the Winter Soldier, respectively. The three of them in the final scene, which you've glimpsed in the trailers, are all great. The performances are fantastic. The other thing I wanted to mention was the character of Baron Zemo, who is basically the villain, who is the shadowy manipulator type character in terms of getting the Avengers to fight one another, in a sense. Now, a lot of people have complained that Baron Zemo is a paper-thin character, but I could not disagree more. I actually loved the character of Baron Zemo in this. You know, not only do I love Daniel Brühl as an actor, he's a great actor. You know, him in Inglourious Basterds and Rush, he's absolutely fantastic. But the character of Zemo, even though he probably only has what equates to about 10 minutes screen time, you completely understand his motivation, you completely understand his plan, and you kind of see where he's coming from. You know, it's unlike most Marvel villains who do just turn up for a one-and-done appearance in a movie. You know, Baron Zemo feels like a well-rounded character with an interesting, dynamic and emotional story arc. It's great that they managed to do that, because it could have quite easily been, you know, the stock movie, I want the Avengers to kill each other kind of villain, and it's not that. It's much more substantial than that, and I think Zemo is a standout villain behind Loki in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And you know, I kind of hope we don't see him again, because he very much reaches the end of his arc in this movie. But you know, it's a testament to really the writers and Daniel Brühl's performance that Zemo was one of the standout things in this film. So, to summarise, Civil War, if I had to describe it in one word, that word would be satisfying. It's not flawless, but it is a hell of a lot of fun. It manages to combine the gritty realism, Bourne-esque action scenes of The Winter Soldier, as well as that type of pacing, with the big splash page comic book action of the Avengers. Not only does it do that and marry those two styles, but it also juggles multiple characters, gives them all satisfying emotional motivations, and really gives nobody short shrift. Yes, it has its flaws. Spider-Man doesn't really naturally fit into the film as such, but that's not to say he's not a good interpretation of Spider-Man, because he totally is. Some of the CGI feels a bit unfinished, probably because of its deadline, but none of that takes away from the overall enjoyment of the film. I loved it, and as I said earlier on, I left it with a huge grin on my face. It's a very satisfying movie. I would recommend checking it out. Maybe the ending, and I won't spoil it, is a little bit too neat, but I completely understand why they ended it in the way that they did. I can't wait to see what the Russo brothers do with the Infinity War movies, both parts 1 and 2, because based on Civil War, you know, it bodes really well for how they'll handle the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. So Civil War, it's a very satisfying movie. If you're a fan of Marvel, you'll love it. Even if you're a casual viewer, you'll get something out of it. It's a very well-made blockbuster. I can't really recommend it enough.